We left off about halfway through Daniel chapter 3. Let me get that here and I will... I believe we're picking up with verse 19. We left off where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been called up to Nebuchadnezzar, and he gave them a second chance for them to fall down and worship this idol. And they pretty much told him, nope, not going to do it. And they were actually, as you're standing before the emperor of an entire, of an empire, they were kind of rude to him. They just said, nope. They didn't even address him as King Nebuchadnezzar. It's like, Nebuchadnezzar? They called him by his first name. No, we're not going to do that. Our God can deliver us, and even if he chooses not to, we're still not going to fall down and worship this thing. So then that brings us down to verse 19. It says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." That's a politically correct way of saying he was a little hacked off at them. You think his facial expression was changed? I'm sure he was probably screaming at them. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and other clothes, were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And you'll notice I'm kind of just, plowing right through this because we've covered most of this, on Sunday evening. Said, for this reason, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. Now, says, and again, just as a reminder, verse 25 was where we left off at on Sunday evening. Because Nebuchadnezzar at this point sees that there's 4 men in there. And I'm not going to rehash all this because we covered this at length on Sunday evening. The fact that Nebuchadnezzar, again, it depends on which version of the Bible you're reading from. Some will say in verse 25 that he says, well, I see 4 men. The 4th one looks like the Son of God. But it's a legitimate translation. It's in accordance with the Aramaic that was written, Son of the gods. Now, knowing again that Nebuchadnezzar at this point is a pagan, he does not believe in the Jewish God. The proper translation here is Son of the gods, plural, because that would have been what Nebuchadnezzar would have said. It may not have been what we would have said, but you got to keep in mind, we cannot ascribe our faith to Nebuchadnezzar at this point. He's not there yet. All right, now let's go down to verse 26. That's where we actually need to pick up at. It says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire." Now, notice at this point, as we lead up to this, Nebuchadnezzar, in his own words, says, and again, as I said, we discussed how we came to this translation on Sunday night. He says, I see someone in there that looks like a son of the gods, plural. Now, as he sees what is going on in there, and he notices that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come forth from the furnace completely unscathed, now notice the change in Nebuchadnezzar's understanding. He is not there as far as having faith yet, but look what he declares in verse 26. He says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace, blazing fire, responded, says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of, notice, the Most high God and come here. Has he called the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob the Most High God before?
No.
Notice the change in Nebuchadnezzar's understanding. Again, we cannot at this point say that Nebuchadnezzar has faith in our God yet, but notice now for the first time he has declared the true God the Most High God. Because, and we'll see this as we get to verse 29, which I'll get to that in a minute, because we'll see why he makes this change. So verse 27, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's high officials gathered around, and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, now again, once again, look what he said. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating, and some translations, and actually the original Aramaic literally says, changing or altering the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. So, this little encounter, this miracle that Nebuchadnezzar has just witnessed, now he is declaring the true God to be the Most High God, and now he is pronouncing his own personal blessings upon God because of what he has seen. So, you know, if here is paganism and over here is faith in God, Nebuchadnezzar started off here, he's now come about maybe to here. He's a long way from declaring faith, but can you see how God is beginning to open his eyes to the truth? He knows Daniel's God, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God, is no ordinary little God among all the ones that he worships. Now notice what he says in verse 29. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap. Now, that's just the reaction of a pagan who's basically, he sees that there's something about Daniel's God here that he doesn't want to get in trouble with this God, because he sees that Daniel's God is powerful. So he says, anybody that says anything about their God, he's in trouble. So now, that's just a pagan reaction. We're not seeing faith in that. But notice what he says next. He says, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. So now we've gone from Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God is merely one God out of who knows how many hundreds of gods they believe in and that they worship, and that as he has brought people from different kingdoms and places that he's conquered, brought them there to Babylon, you've got a mishmash of all kinds of religious beliefs there. And by the way, the Babylonians didn't matter, they didn't care what God you worshipped or where you were from, as long as you were also willing to worship the Babylonian God. That's what brought this whole affair about to begin with. He never told Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego they couldn't worship God. They just had to also worship the Babylonian God. It was their refusal to do that got them in trouble. And then when they stood their ground, then Nebuchadnezzar sees what happens. Notice what because keep in mind, what did Nebuchadnezzar tell them before he threw them in? He said, if you don't do this, I'm going to throw you into the fire pit, and does anybody remember the rest of it? he says there's no God that can save you from this. That was in the first part of chapter 3 that we studied like a week ago.
What God is there who can deliver you out of my hand?
Exactly. So basically he's saying nobody can deliver. He said, you're at my mercy. And now he's gone from what God, or that's another way of saying no God can save you, to now he says there is no other God who is able to deliver like this. Now, again, he's not come to faith, but he recognizes that of all the gods they worship, Daniel's God is up here. He is a God all by himself, that he is much more powerful. Now, why is it from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective? Why did God have to get him to the point that he made or recognized that fact as God? Because what is going on here? These are no ordinary interactions between a pagan and God's people. I honestly believe that God orchestrated these events specifically to bring Nebuchadnezzar to faith. So what was the lesson Nebuchadnezzar had to learn and had to get out of his mind, or a belief he had to get out of his mind to come to that faith?
He wasn't
That
a
there's
God.
only one God.
Well, not only that there's only one God, but
He wasn't a God.
yeah, and that Nebuchadnezzar wasn't one, but also keep in mind Nebuchadnezzar in the not too many years previous to this had defeated Judah. He'd overrun their territory. He'd captured Judah. He'd taken all the Jews into captivity. And in their belief, each little region or country had its own God. If Nebuchadnezzar is able to defeat Judah, in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, what does that mean to him?
He defeated their God.
Exactly. His God is more powerful than the Jews' God, because if the Jewish God had been so powerful, I wouldn't have been able to defeat you. And so that's what's in the back of Nebuchadnezzar's mind. I guarantee you he's thinking that. That's one of the reasons why he says that if my God can't save you, well then there must not be any God that can, because I've defeated all of you, including your Jewish God. Well, guess what? Now he's found out that, whoa, wait a minute. That Jewish God's more powerful than I thought. Because I know my God can't do this, but yet the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just kept them from getting killed, and they don't even smell like smoke. So now he's come a little bit farther in his journey to faith, to the point that, again, he has not professed faith at this point. That comes another 7 years later. But he's at the point that he recognizes that this is no ordinary little God. Daniel's God is powerful, and he's more powerful than mine. I don't know how I was able to defeat them, but I know my God couldn't do what he just did.
This isn't the only place in the Old Testament where the term Most High God is used.
Oh, it's El Elyon.
It seems to me that it's almost a way of the Jews being somewhat politically correct to the pagans by not pissing them off and telling them your gods don't exist. It's a way of saying our God, the one true God, is above all these other things that you believe are gods, which aren't really gods.
You're putting the emphasis on the wrong thing, though. It's not that, well, there's this God, and this God, and this God, and our God is the Most High. The term El Elyon, let me write this out for you, so you can see it in writing here. What that means, again, is not that he's the highest God of many, but that wherever God is, he is
above everything.
At the Most High. You can't get any higher than our God is. So the emphasis is not on his comparison with other gods. It's not this way, but the comparison is this way. That our God is, if we're here, our God is, he is Most High. That's the emphasis on this, on the term, the Most High God. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right, any other questions on chapter 3?
When you think about, when you compare us and compare what just happened there to Nebuchadnezzar, our faith, is things unseen.
Mm-hmm.
God felt like he had to show Nebuchadnezzar to get his point. In other words, he wasn't going to go on faith the way we go on faith.
Mm-hmm.
He had to be shown.
Well, it's not only that, but is Nebuchadnezzar any different than the rest of us? That how many of the rest of us, the first time you hear the gospel, you're just like, oh yeah, I believe that, I'll accept it. Very few people do. Some, but in the greater scheme of things, almost all of us have to be exposed to the gospel numerous times over the course of a period of time as we learn more and our faith grows until we finally get to that last point where we say, yes, I believe. That's what's going on with Nebuchadnezzar. And one of the reasons why I believe this whole story is so important and why God, I think, revealed himself to Nebuchadnezzar, take the comparison with the Ninevites. And this was the lesson that Jonah had to learn. Jonah wanted the Ninevites to die and go to hell. I mean, there's no question about it. Jonah hated them because they were a brutal people. But God forced him to go there. And the whole point of the story at the end of it is, you know, if you care about this little bush that grew up and then withered, you know, and now you're sitting there in the heat, don't you think I would care about this city, this great city here of all these people that are lost? God had to show Jonah that the Jews weren't the only people he cares about. God cares about even the pagans, and was willing to send Jonah specifically to a pagan people to call them to repentance and faith in order to save them. And what we're seeing here is, while these aren't the Ninevites, these are the Babylonians, the story is an almost perfect parallel, is that God has sent his whole people there, and specifically Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as their representatives to bring Nebuchadnezzar to faith. Because again, if Nebuchadnezzar is the king, if Nebuchadnezzar can be brought to faith, what will happen to the rest of them? The whole country will ultimately follow Nebuchadnezzar's example. I had a friend of mine, I'll tell you this quick story before we go on into chapter 4. And no, this isn't going to be a long story, so if you're sitting there looking at the clock thinking he'll never make it. No, this story won't take that long. I used to pastor a church up in northwest Indiana, just outside of Gary, a town called Lake Station, which years ago was actually called East Gary, till they changed the name of it because they didn't want to be associated with the city of Gary. Because Gary, if you know anything about Gary, Indiana, it is one of the most crime-ridden, brutal place. You don't want to get caught, out on the street after dark in Gary, Indiana. It is dangerous. Well, one of the pastors that I knew up there, and actually he was a black pastor that pastored one of the African American churches right in the middle of downtown Gary. And when I met him, he'd only been there about year and a half, 2 years maybe. He said when he first got there, every single week, he said there was a gang group that would, wander around the church, that were busting out his windows. They were writing graffiti all over the side of the church. He said every Monday morning he'd have a group of volunteers in the church that would get out there and paint over the graffiti. They'd get the windows fixed. And he said while they're doing it, he knew who was busting the windows out and doing all the vandalism, because they were standing. There was a whole group of them standing across the street from the church laughing at him. And sure enough, before the week was out, they'd bust his windows out again. Next Monday morning, they'd be out there fixing them and painting over the graffiti again. Same group, brought back out there laughing at him. He said this went on for the first month he was there. After about a month of this, he finally told a group of the people that were there fixing the stuff up, he said, I'm tired of this, I'm going to deal with it. They, of course, thought he was going to go across the street and challenge these guys to a fight or something. And they're all like, oh, no, you don't want to do that, you're going to get killed. He said, just trust me. He walks across the street, because, of course, you know, if you know anything about gangs, it doesn't take long to figure out who the leader of the gang is. I mean, they will all do whatever he says, and they'll defer to his leadership. So he already by this point figured out who the leader of the gang was. He went right straight to him. Didn't just confront him, but he said, you know, kind of hot out here, guys. Why don't you come on inside? Come into my office and sit down where it's cool, and I'll get you something to drink, get you a snack. And of course, they're all like, what? He says, yeah, come on in. So he convinces them, at least some of them, including the leader of the group, to go in his office, got him a Coke, gave him a snack, sat and talked with him, just chewed the fat, you know, for a while the windows were being fixed. And then, of course, sure enough, the next week they did it again. And he said the same thing. The next week, he went out there, invited him to come back into his office and sit in the air conditioning and have a drink and a snack while they fixed the windows and painted over the graffiti. But you knew what was going on while he had him in there. He's developing a relationship with them and sharing the gospel with them. He said it took him about a month. And after about a month, he led the leader of the gang to the Lord. And after that, once he led the leader of the gang to Christ, he said one by one, within a matter of weeks, every single member of the gang had become a church member, had been baptized. He said half of them were singing in his choir. Vandalism stopped. No more graffiti, no more busted windows, no more people out there on the sidewalk laughing at him, because they were all now in his church. Now, fast forward to the following year, when the city of Gary was figuring out what their crime statistics were, he said the Gary Police Department published the city's crime statistics. He said in the downtown area, crime from the previous year to the year after had gone down by over 30%, and they couldn't figure out what happened.
God happened.
Yeah. But the issue was, he knew how to approach the situation. He led the leader of the gang to Christ. The rest followed, one right after the other. That is what God is doing with Nebuchadnezzar here. God knows that if he can lead the king to Christ, all of them will convert.
One quick question on verse 30. He says that he didn't give him providence, so he's gonna. Is that showing fear, do you think, or is he just trying to appease? Well,
keep in mind, we've already been told that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were already in leadership positions over the province of Babylon, which was the geographical area in and around Babylon.
Right.
And when it says that they were caused to prosper, more than likely what the meaning behind that is, he gave him a promotion.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But I wonder what his intent was when he did that. If it was to appease, or it wasn't. Interested.
We'll have to ask. Yeah. We'll have to ask him when that time comes.
Yeah,
I mean, whether it's because he wants to get in good with their God, or whether he's wanting, to reward them personally. We don't know at this point what his motivation is. Could be a little of both.
Yeah. Can I use him to help me?
Fear back there.
And it could be. And by the way, using them to help him, that's actually biblical, because how many times does the Bible actually tell us that where God's people are, as they prosper, the people around them will prosper? He actually told his people through Jeremiah, said, pray for the prosperity of Babylon, because while you're there, your prosperity will rub off on them. God actually told them that through Jeremiah. All right, chapter 4. Now, again, keep in mind, beginning in verse 5 of chapter 2, all of what we're reading right now is all in Aramaic. Now, for the most part, with just a few exceptions, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew. All of what we have been reading, and I realize that while you're looking at an English translation, you can't tell the difference. But it's important to keep in mind that this is all in Aramaic. And one of the reasons why, you'll see, beginning in chapter 4, because notice who's being quoted here. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound. It had seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God, there's that term again, El Elyon, the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. That is a direct quote. That is not Daniel writing that. That is Nebuchadnezzar who's saying this. Now, chapter 4 is not a follow-on to chapter 3. Chapter 4 is an introduction, or what should say these first 3 verses is an introduction to what we're about to be told about, which is Nebuchadnezzar's dream about this great tree. This is when Nebuchadnezzar comes to faith. And we know that he did because, notice in chapter 3, he just basically declares, I don't want to hear anybody say anything bad about, about their God. And he declares that he is the Most High God. But there's a big difference between that and notice what he says in this introduction to chapter 4. Verse 2, for example, it seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. We're now personalizing it. He doesn't just say that this is a powerful God. He's saying, these things that God has done for me. How great are his signs? How mighty are his wonders? Does that sound like a praise of somebody who knows God now? By the way, one of the ways that you can tell if somebody actually knows Christ versus somebody who just knows about Christ, if you're trying to witness to somebody and you ask them, who is Jesus to you? Their answer to that question will almost invariably be answered one of 2 ways. Either if they're a Christian or if they just simply know about Christianity. If they tell you, well, Jesus, he's God, Jesus is a great teacher, Jesus is this, Jesus is that, that's the words of someone who knows about Jesus but doesn't know Jesus. If they have a relationship with Christ, they will tell you Jesus is what?
My Lord and
my
Savior.
Lord. Not he is the Lord or he is God Almighty. He is my God and my Savior. They will personalize it. Notice what Nebuchadnezzar's doing here. This is in the first person where he is what he has done for me. And he's declaring his faith in God in the first person.
But he hasn't done anything for him.
Not yet. Because keep in mind, these first 3 verses of chapter 4, this is Nebuchadnezzar introducing what he's about to tell you, which begins in chapter 4. Verse 4. Now, as we begin verse 4, we don't know the exact timeline of this. We don't know how much time has elapsed between chapter 3 and chapter 4. What we do know is that these first 3 verses, as he introduces this story, happened at least 7 years later. By the way, one thing we have to keep in mind when we're praying for people to be saved, we're almost always in a much bigger hurry than God is.
Seed.
God's in no hurry.
Plant seed.
Yep. Now, verse 4. Now, at this point, I can guarantee you we're not going to cover all of chapter 4 tonight, but we will get started. What's that?
Shocker.
Shocker? Okay. Now, we'll just cover at this point the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had. Or actually, it was a dream. We'll save the interpretation of it and what happened, the fulfillment of it, for Sunday night. Verse 4. And notice again, this is all in the first person. This is Nebuchadnezzar relating this. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream and it made me fearful. And these fantasies as I lay on my bed and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. But finally, Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I related the dream to him, saying, now let me stop there. Notice at this point in verse 8, as he's relating this, he does say that Daniel's Aramaic name is Belteshazzar, after the name of my God. So as he's relating this, he does refer to Bel as his God at this point. But that doesn't necessarily mean he still has faith in Bel, because, for example, how many, I'm going to pick on the men here, since Nebuchadnezzar is telling this from a man's perspective. I'm going to pick on the men. How many of you men in here have ever had a car, not one you've got now, but a car that maybe you had when you were younger, that was just your favorite car ever? Sports car or something? All right. Tell me about it.
69 Grand Prix.
All right, but tell me about it.
Well, it was loaded. It had leather interior. It was British racing green. Had all the bells and whistles. 425 horsepower, and it won me my wife. She married the car. Not me.
Okay.
All right, but whose car was it?
It was mine.
Okay. Now notice when I asked you whose car it was, you said my car. But now is it your car? You still have that car?
Nope.
No, of course not. But you still, even though it's a car you no longer have, you referred to it as my car, right?
At that time, yeah.
And there you go. That's what's going on here. Nebuchadnezzar's just being historical. Because at one point in his life, Bel was his God. And he's saying that, well, I had renamed Daniel Belteshazzar after the name of my God. Well, he's not again saying that it's his God then, but it was his God when he renamed Daniel. It's a historical, just like, for example, if we talk about the school we graduated from, probably every one of us in here graduated from high school anywhere from 40 to 60 years ago, didn't we? But yet, if I ask you to describe your school, how are you going to describe it? My high school.
Well,
Yeah, but
Merrill's high
Nebuchadnezzar,
school
I bet
too.
he didn't have a Grand Prix.
He might have had a grand horse.
Chariot.
Yeah, there you go. It was his grand chariot. All right, so let's continue. But I did want to hit that because I know if you're paying attention, you would have caught that and wondered about that. All right, verse 9. O Belteshazzar, chief of the musicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream which I've seen, along with its interpretation. Now these were the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all the living creatures fed themselves from it. I was looking in the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. Now, by the way, let me stop once again. This term watcher, this is one of the only places in the Old Testament where you'll find the term watcher. And Nebuchadnezzar does refer to him as watcher several times more in this chapter. In the original Aramaic and even in Hebrew, that's really, literally all this term means, is it's a watcher. There's not some mysterious meaning behind that. It just means watcher. But as far as we can tell from this and other sources, a watcher was apparently some particular class of angels whose job it was to, guess what? Watch. They watched over us. And by the way, I'm not going to get really deep in it, but there are a lot of what we call extra biblical. You know what I mean by the term extra biblical?
Beyond.
Explained, yeah.
The term extra means outside of or in addition to. So if it's extra biblical, it didn't come from in here. It's just some other historical sources. So I say that for this reason. If it's extra biblical, you take it with a grain of salt. It might be true, it might not be true. But there are extra biblical sources that would indicate there were actually two classes of watchers. Some who were angels whose job it was to watch over humanity. And there are some other sources that would indicate that some of those watchers were involved in the angelic fall that we can trace back to Genesis chapter 6, that got involved in human affairs in ways they weren't supposed to. Now, since I don't really want to get too deep into that, because that in itself is an hour, 2 hour long study that really does not affect what we're looking at right now. But as you're reading through this term watcher, that literally is all it means. They were watchers. But yes, some kind of angelic being. Verse 14, he shouted out, he being the watcher, and spoke as follows. Chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the beast flee from under it and the birds from its branches, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the new grass of the field, and let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beast in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast mind be given to it. By the way, there is actually a documented mental disease that's called, depending on how it manifests itself, lycanthropy or boanthropy. I can spell that out for you here in the chart in a minute. Lycanthropy basically is the belief that you've become a wolf. Boanthropy is the belief that you're an animal of some other sort. But yes, there are documented cases of people, and they may still be otherwise in their right minds, in the sense that they can communicate, go about daily affairs, but still have the weird belief that they're actually a cat or a dog or a wolf or whatever. It's been documented.
This is going on in the town that I live in the school. My grandkids have told me about these kids saying that they're a cat, they're a dog, and being serious about it.
They meow and they
Oh yeah.
expect to be treated.
And so they can still communicate with you, still do their schoolwork, and still be.
It's very scary.
And that's what apparently has happened to. That's what's apparently happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He's flipped. At least that's he's being told is going to happen to him. That he's going to have the mind of a beast, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. By the way, you can interpret that as 7 years. The sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that, once here's that term, the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whom he wishes, and sets it over the lowliest of men. This is the dream which I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, tell me its interpretation, inasmuch as none of the wise men of my kingdom is able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for a spirit of the holy gods is in you. Now, we're going to stop there for the night. Now, notice there is one change. Now, again, I realize we skipped over chapter 2 for now, but just as a reminder for those of you, if you haven't read chapter 2 or if it's been a while, in chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar had a dream then that Daniel interpreted, Nebuchadnezzar refused to tell his wise men what the dream was. He said, I'll know if you really know what you're doing, if you can not only interpret it, but you got to first tell me what it was that I dreamed, because I'm not going to tell you. Daniel was the only one in chapter 2 that walks in later and actually tells him, well, Nebuchadnezzar, here's what you dreamed about. Of course, the fact that he knew and Nebuchadnezzar hadn't told anybody, that got Nebuchadnezzar's attention, and then Daniel interpreted it. Notice now he's already been convinced of Daniel's ability. He doesn't have to, pull this trick this time. Now he just tells Daniel flat out up front, here's what I dreamed, Daniel. Tell me what it meant. What it meant. He trusts Daniel enough, he doesn't do that little trick with him this time to force Daniel to go back and pray about what the dream was. He just tells him. But now,
But he still had all the other fakers come in before Daniel. So if he already knew Daniel was the one who could interpret it, why bother with all those others?
Well, and again, all we can do is just kind of speculate about that. Some people believe that Daniel may have been providentially hindered or been off busy doing something else in order to prove once again to Nebuchadnezzar that all these other guys can't interpret it. Nebuchadnezzar may have needed a reminder that all of these other guys, they're spiritually impotent. Only Daniel and a worshiper of the true Most High God can do this. And that's the most likely interpretation of what most theologians believe probably happened, is that Daniel got busy doing something else. Nebuchadnezzar just needed a reminder that those other guys couldn't do it. So then he calls Daniel, and Daniel comes in and proceeds to do this. But also keep in mind that even though Nebuchadnezzar is relating to this, he's relating it to you in chronological order. And at that point in his life, Nebuchadnezzar knew Daniel had a spirit, notice he says spirit of the gods within him, and that he's seen what God can do. He's still not yet at a point of professing faith in Daniel's God. He's still a pagan. I mean, he's come from here to here, but he's still a pagan deep at heart. And it's the fulfillment of this dream that finally, which we see, and we'll cover on Sunday evening, that finally opens Nebuchadnezzar's eyes, and at that point he looks up and says, "You are God." But he's not there yet. And I think the good news for us, notice Nebuchadnezzar's got his entire life here ahead of him. And we know that even from the beginning of this dream until the end is not just 7, it's 8 years. Because God allowed him a year to repent before God executed this sentence upon him. And then 7 years of doing that, God, not only is God not in a hurry, but God is patient. We can fight and squirm and run, but if God wants us, God's going to get us. And he's very patient about it.
Amen.
Anybody else?
Still a very prideful man too.
That's what caused this whole.
Oh, absolutely.
That's the whole lesson of chapter 4 is his pride got him.
He still thinks he's got
Oh, yeah.
control of everything.
Which again, we're going to cover all that Sunday evening. Stan, would you lead us in